In the mid-1990s, the New York Islanders were a proud franchise fallen on hard times. A team that had won 4 straight Stanley Cups in the early 1980s were now in turmoil and mismanagement. Fan morale was low, amplified by the infamous Fisherman logo rebrand fiasco and the unstable ownership. Into this chaos, however, stepped Mike Milbury in 1995. Fresh off a stint coaching the Boston Bruins, Milbury was hired as Islanders head coach and within 3 months also handed the general manager GM duties. It was an unusual dual role born out of desperation, but the Islanders ownership hoped Milbury's fiery personality and hockey pedigree would revive the team. Little did they know, his tenure would instead become infamous for a series of disastrous decisions that many believed destroyed the team's future. This is the story of how Mike Milbury ruined the New York Islanders. Milbury took over a franchise in turmoil. One instant that foreshadowed its dysfunction was the brief 1996 ownership of John Spano, a con man who fraudulently tried to buy the team, plunging the Islanders into embarrassment and financial uncertainty. Against this backdrop, Milbury was tasked with cutting costs and rebuilding. In fact, during Milbury's GM tenure, the Islanders owners mandated an austere budget, which means the team's owners were extremely strict with money, cutting costs wherever possible, turning the once proud franchise into a fragile operation. Milbury himself later said he was forced to pinch pennies by upper management. Yet, while budget constraints did play a role, Milbury also made many unforced errors, baffling trades and draft decisions that were not imposed by ownership. These moves would deal body blow after body blow to the Islanders' long-term prospects. Milbury's first few years set a tone. He quickly earned the nickname Mad Mike for his aggressive, often head-scratching roster moves. In January 1996, only months into the job, Milbury executed a trade of recent top draft picks that confirmed his high-risk approach. The Islanders had selected Wade Redden, second overall in 1995, but Milbury sent the 18-year-old defenseman, along with goalie Damian Rhodes, to Ottawa in exchange for 1995's first overall pick, Brian Berard, veteran goalie Don Burpress, and forward Martin Straka. Berard was a highly touted offensive defenseman who would go on to win the NHL's Calder Trophy as Rookie of the Year in 1997. So initially, this gamble looked quite smart. However, the downside soon became apparent. Wade Redden blossomed into a steady top-pair defenseman and cornerstone in Ottawa for many years, while Berard's time on Long Island proved brief. This early trade would become a pattern. Milbury often shipped out young talent before they could reach their prime, in hopes of a quick fix. Another move that rattled the fanbase was trading the hard-nosed defenseman Varius Kasparaitis, a fan favorite known for his hitting in November 1996. Milbury sent Kasparaitis and forward Andreas Johnson to Pittsburgh for center Brian Smolinski. Smolinski was a decent scorer, but moving a popular young defenseman soon was controversial. Islanders fans, already wary from years of decline, started to grow anxious that Mad Mike was too trigger-happy with the team's assets, and by 1997, the Islanders' ownership saga took another bizarre turn. The fraudulent Spano ownership fell apart, and new owners entered the picture, bringing more uncertainty. Milbury, juggling coach and GM roles, relinquished his head coach duties in January 1997 to focus solely on being GM. The team's performance on the ice, however, remained very poor. They routinely missed the playoffs, but Milbury kept busy on the trading front. That became in the 1997 to 1998 season, when Milbury made one of his most short-sighted trades. Believing the team needed veteran leadership and scoring, he set sights on Vancouver Canucks captain Trevor Linden, a very respected forward. And in February 1998, the Islanders acquired Linden, but paid a steep price. Milbury traded away the Islanders' 2 brightest stars, Tal Bertuzzi and Brian McCabe, along with a third-round draft pick. Bertuzzi was a power forward the Isles had drafted in 1993, and McCabe was a solid defenseman drafted in 1993 as well, both just 22 at the time. However, these two would soon flourish elsewhere. Bertuzzi went on to 6 straight 50-plus point seasons, including multiple 30-goal campaigns for Vancouver, and McCabe became an all-star defenseman in Toronto a few years later. However, the Islanders' part of the trade didn't go so well. Linden, meanwhile, played only 107 games and never reached his old scoring heights. As he was traded away again in 1999, the Islanders fans were left sore of the loss of 2 potential franchise cornerstones who hit their prime in different jerseys. As one account dryly noted, after this trade, aside from Ziggy Palfy, there wasn't much support, since Milbury traded any hope of that away. This was a hard pill to swallow. The team still wasn't better, and now 2 of their top young assets were gone. However, things just kept getting worse. In the same time frame, Milbury demonstrated a baffling impatience with draft picks. The Islanders held the 3rd overall pick in the 1996 NHL draft and selected winger Jean-Pierre Dumont, a promising junior scorer, but Dumont never played a single game for the Islanders. Milbury traded him in 1998 before he even touched the ice as an Islander. That summer, Milbury sent Dumont plus a 5th round pick to Chicago in exchange for winger Dmitry Nabokov. Nabokov was a former 1st round pick who had shown scoring touch in junior, but he produced just 13 points in 30 games for New York before disappearing to Europe. Meanwhile, Dumont went on to have a solid NHL career elsewhere, including multiple 20-goal seasons, making this another example of Milbury giving up a talent way too soon. Moves like this made Milbury very unfavored in the eyes of the fans, who watched homegrown prospects thrive on other teams. By the end of 1998, the Islanders were no closer to escaping the NHL's basement. In fact, the constant turnover arguably left them worse. The team's finances were so strained and fan interest was so low that even more major cost cutting was looming. Attendance was low, and the arena itself was aging and falling apart. The franchise's once loyal fanbase was fed up and was staying home, and ownership was operating on a very little budget, putting the Islanders near the bottom of the league in spending. In this climate, Milbury was about to make one of his most painful moves of all. That wasn't entirely his fault, but symbolized how far the mighty had fallen. If any single moment signaled the bottom of the Islanders' late 90s collapse, it was the Ziggy Palfy trade in 1999. Palfy was the Islanders' star, a dynamic winger who had 3 straight 40-goal seasons in the mid-90s, and was arguably the only reason fans still had to cheer. However, Palfy's contract, over $24 million over 5 years, was too rich for the team with financial problems. And in the summer of 1999, the Islanders owners, Howard Milstein and Steven Gluckstern, ordered Milbury to slash payroll, and no one was off limits, not even Palfy, the face of the franchise. What followed was a saga that enraged the fanbase. Milbury negotiated a deal to send Palfy to the LA Kings, but NHL Commissioner Gary Bettman initially vetoed the trade because it was so in LA's favor. Desperate to dump Palfy's salary, Milbury even entertained an idea of trading Palfy across the town to the rival New York Rangers. Islanders fans didn't want to imagine the thought of their star winger wearing Ranger blue. It would have become the ultimate betrayal. Thankfully for the Islanders fans, that nightmare was avoided when the Rangers talks fell through. Instead, Milbury circled back to the Kings and finally struck a deal. In June 1999, the Islanders traded Ziggy Palfy, along defenseman Marcel Consignia and center Brian Smolinski to Los Angeles. In return, New York received a collection of young pieces: former 1st round pick Olli Jokinen, prospect Josh Green, defenseman Matthew Byron, and the 8th overall pick in the 1999. On paper, it wasn't a terrible haul for a rebuilding team in financial despair. Jokinen had been the 3rd overall pick in 1997, and Taylor Piat, drafted with that 8th overall pick, was a big power forward prospect. However, it was the context which was brutal. This was a pure salary dump of an elite player in his prime, due to the ownership penny pinching. The return ultimately did little for the franchise. Jokinen, the key piece coming back, played just 1 full season on Long Island before Milbury traded him. More on that disastrous deal a little bit later. Piat also lasted only 2 seasons before being shipped out. In essence, by a couple years later, the Islanders had nothing to show for Ziggy Palfy's departure. Ziggy, for his part, continued to star in LA and later Pittsburgh when healthy, and even earned introduction into the IHF Hall of Fame in 2019 for his international career. The trade was a gut punch for Islanders fans. It underscored the franchise's dysfunction, a combination of tight budget ownership and the GM willing to trade just about anyone. Local newspapers blasted the move, and the team's reputation around the league sank even further, if that was possible. After trading Palfy, Milbury himself acknowledged the backlash, saying with the fans' reaction, "I don't think it was warm and fuzzy." The Islanders had now missed the playoffs 7 of the last 8 seasons, and 1999 would be no different. But astonishingly, the worst was still to come. Milbury was about to double down on his aggressive rebuilding plan in a way that would haunt the Islanders for decades. Before we move on, it's worth noting Milbury's fanatic flurry of trades in 1999. That January, he dealt away Brian Berard, the Calder-winning defenseman he'd once prized. He was traded to Toronto for veteran goalie Felix Potvin. Potvin, past his prime, managed only a few wins before being let go. Soon after, Milbury shipped away fan-favorite goalie Tommy Salo to Edmonton. for Brad Isbister and a 3rd round pick. Isbister flashed at times but never rose above a middle 6 role, while Salo thrived with the Oilers. By the year's end, with Palfy, Berard, Salo, and others gone for meaningless returns, the Islanders were stripped of talent and sank to the dead last in the NHL, cementing their status as a league laughingstock. However, if people thought that 1999 was rock bottom, June 24th, 2000 was the day Mike Milbury attempted to dynamite his way out of the rubble, only to collapse the mine on himself. On that day, at the 2000 NHL entry draft, Milbury orchestrated a franchise-altering series of moves so shocking that it still sends shivers down Islanders fans. It was a day of bold gambles, each meant to rebuild the Islanders quickly, and most of them would backfire. Going into the 2000 draft, the Islanders owned the 1st overall pick. The consensus top prospects that year were forwards like Danny Heatley and Marian Gaborik, high-scoring talents the team needed. But Milbury had an unconventional plan. He was enamored with a young goaltender from Boston University named Rick DiPietro. Despite already having a blue-chip 21-year-old goalie in Roberto Luongo, Milbury became convinced DiPietro would become a franchise goalie and the cornerstone of the Islanders' future. In a shocking move, Milbury used the number 1 overall selection in 2000 to draft Rick DiPietro. The first time in NHL history, a goalie had been taken 1st overall. The decision meant passing on Heatley and Gaborik, who went 2nd and 3rd, and would both become elite NHL scorers. It also meant Roberto Luongo's days were numbered, since DiPietro's arrival made the young star Luongo somewhat expandable in Milbury's eyes. However, Milbury didn't want to see how DiPietro would develop. On the same day, he made the bombshell move of trading Roberto Luongo. And it wasn't just Luongo. To get what he wanted, Milbury packaged Olli Jokinen, the talented 21-year-old center acquired in the Palfy trade that I had just previously mentioned, with Luongo in a trade with the Florida Panthers. In return, the Islanders received 2 players, winger Mark Parrish and forward Oleg Kwasha. The NHL world was stunned. Luongo was widely regarded as the best young goalie prospect in the world, a future star, and Jokinen was just starting to find his footing. Parrish and Kwasha were decent young forwards. Parrish would actually score 20+ goals a few times for the Isles, but they were nowhere near the caliber of what many felt the Isles had surrendered. In hindsight, this trade is considered one of the worst in NHL history. Jokinen became a top-line center in Florida, scoring 419 points over the next 7 seasons, far more than Parrish and Kwasha combined in that span. And Roberto Luongo, of course, blossomed into a superstar goaltender, a multiple-time All-Star who'd eventually set records and carry teams deep into the playoffs. The Islanders, meanwhile, were left with a huge void in net that DiPietro, for all of his potential, would struggle to fill for years. At the 2000 draft, Milbury infamously insisted, "We didn't get chopped liver in return. It's a win-win day for us. We're doing a little dance over the Islander table." This quote has aged very poorly, often sarcastically cited by fans. The reality was that the trade crippled the Islanders even more, and the talent pipeline was non-existent for years. They gave away a future Hall of Fame goalie and a solid scorer for relatively meager returns. And Milbury still wasn't done on that fateful draft day. Earlier that day, he had also traded goalie Kevin Weeks along with prospect Christian Goodrock and a pick to Tampa Bay in order to acquire the 5th overall pick in 2000. Weeks had only been an Islander briefly. Milbury had gotten him in the Potvin trade, but he was another young goalie being shipped out. Using the 5th pick, Milbury selected winger Rafi Torres. This was another gamble. Torres was projected as a power forward with grit, but other talented players like future stars Scott Hartnell, Ron Hainsey, and others were still on the board. Torres ultimately never scored a goal in the Islanders uniform, having 0 goals in 31 games, and soon was traded away as well. Finally, Milbury capped off the day by flipping yet another top prospect. He traded defenseman Eric Brewer, the Islanders' 5th overall pick in 1997, to the Edmonton Oilers. In return, the Isles got Roman Harmlich, a former number 1 overall pick in 1992, and an established top 4 defenseman. Unlike many other Milbury trades, this one actually proved a reasonable return. Harmlich played 4 productive seasons on Long Island and was key during the team's early 2000s playoff pushes. Brewer went on to a solid career, but it was a price Milbury felt was worth paying for immediate help on the blue line. When the dust finally settled on that infamous draft day, the Islanders fans were left reeling. In a span of hours, Milbury had drafted Rick DiPietro number 1, a shock to everyone, traded away Roberto Luongo, traded away Olli Jokinen, traded away Kevin Weeks, traded away Eric Brewer, all young players who would go on to success elsewhere, and brought in a handful of new faces. These moves were unquestionably bold. As one analyst later noted, Milbury's moves were always the type that if it worked out, it would make him look smarter than everyone else. But when it inevitably didn't, he spoke with enough confidence about the next one to make make you believe that he knew what he was doing. Indeed, Milbury talked a brave game, saying of DiPietro, goaltending being the most important position, we think he's a very special player. It's gutsy, maybe crazy, but at least we have the courage of our convictions. The Islanders fans, however, were unconvinced. At a draft party on Long Island that day, the crowd reportedly booed loudly when the news broke of the Luongo-Yashin trade. Even Milbury later admitted the reaction was far from positive. With hindsight, the day still stands as a franchise turning point for the worse. The Islanders had wagered their future on a risky hand, a teenage goalie and a patchwork of role players, whilst giving away most of their talent. Having gutted the roster and reassembled it with his draft day fireworks, Milbury entered the 2000 to 2001 season of a very young squad. Unsurprisingly to many, however, the team remained near the bottom of the standings and missed the playoffs once again. But off the ice, a significant change occurred. New ownership with deeper pockets arrived. In April 2000, tech entrepreneurs Charles Wang and Sanjay Kumar purchased the Islanders. Unlike the previous owners, Wang was willing to spend to improve the team. He kept Milbury as GM, giving him yet another chance, but now with actual financial backing to right the ship. Milbury seized the opportunity in the summer of 2001 with 2 more blockbuster moves, aiming to catapult the Islanders. At the 2001 NHL draft, Milbury pulled the trigger on a headline-grabbing trade. The Islanders held the 2nd overall pick in 2001, another high pick from their poor 2000-2001 finish. Milbury packaged that pick in a towering 24-year-old defenseman named Zdeno Chara and sent him to the Ottawa Senators. In return, the Islanders received superstar center Yashin. Yashin was a proven elite scorer, a 5-time 30-goal scorer in Ottawa, but came with baggage. He sat out a season in contract dispute. The 2nd overall pick New York gave up in this deal turned into Jason Spezza, a highly touted junior center. In essence, Milbury bet on Yashin's immediate star power over Spezza's future potential, and he sacrificed Chara, a young defenseman with size and raw ability, to do it. This trade in hindsight became one of the most infamous of the Milbury era. Yashin did initially help the Islanders in 2001 to 2002 season. He led the team with 75 points, and the Islanders made the playoffs for the first time in 8 years. The team's one-year turnaround was remarkable. After finishing last in 2001, the Isles jumped to 96 points in 2001 to 2002. Fans finally had hope again, and they even took the Toronto Maple Leafs to a thrilling 7-game series in the 2002 playoffs, though they just fell short in Game 7. However, the long-term cost of Yashin's deal became painfully clear. Zdeno Chara, the throw-in player in that trade, blossomed in Ottawa into a dominant all-star defenseman, and would eventually become a Norris Trophy winner and a Stanley Cup champion elsewhere. Jason Spezza, once he reached the NHL, became a franchise center for Ottawa, racking up nearly 1,000 points. By contrast, Yashin's impact waned after a strong first year. Milbury immediately signed Yashin to an enormous 10-year, $87.5 million contract, one of the largest in the NHL at the time, expecting him to be Islanders' franchise player for the next decade. Yashin never hit the heights of his Ottawa days. His point totals declined in subsequent seasons, and he struggled with injuries, missing half of 2003 to 2004 with a serious forearm injury. By the mid-2000s, he was highly paid, but moderately productive. In a cruel twist, Spezza and Chara helped eliminate the Islanders in the first round of the 2003 playoffs, in which Ottawa beat New York 4-1. It was a poetic revenge for the Senators, and a bitter reminder to the Isles of what had been sacrificed. The other big move in summer 2000 was acquiring for the center Michael Pekka. Pekka, a former Selke Trophy winner, defensive forward and captain of the Buffalo Sabres, was brought in to be the Islanders' new captain. To get him, Milbury traded 2 former first-round draft forwards, Tim Connolly, 5th overall in 1999, and Tyler Piat, the 8th overall pick from the Palfy trade, and sent them to Buffalo. Pekka's impact was immediate. His leadership and two-way play changed the team culture, and he was a major factor in the 2001-2002 resurgence. The Islanders now boasted a core of Yashin, Pekka, young sniper Mark Parrish, solid defensemen like Kenny Johnson, Roman Harmlich, and of course the goalie Rick DiPietro, plus veteran Chris Osgood, whom Milbury had picked up on waivers in 2001. Indeed, picking up Chris Osgood off waivers from Detroit in 2001 turned out to be a good move. The 2-time Stanley Cup champion goalie provided stability in the net and helped propel the Islanders back to the playoffs. For a brief moment, it seemed Milbury's wild gambles were somehow paying off. The Islanders made the playoffs in 2002 for the first time since 1994, ending a long drought. Long Island was buzzing again, and Milbury earned some praise for retooling the roster dramatically. In 2002 to 2003, the Isles returned to the playoffs, losing in the first round to Ottawa, and again in 2003 to 2004, losing to Tampa Bay. After nearly a decade of irrelevance, the team was at least competitive. However, these successes were fleeting, and arguably in spite spite of Milbury's moves as much as because of them. The foundation was shaky. The star acquisitions he had brought in had issues. Yashin's consistency and work ethic were questioned. Pekka suffered a devastating knee injury in the 2002 playoffs that sidelined him for much of the 2002 to 2003 season. And meanwhile, many of the departed young players blossomed elsewhere, leaving the Owls with a depleted pipeline of talent to sustain success. Milbury also continued to make questionable decisions even in these good years. For example, at the 2003 trade deadline, as the Islanders fought off for a playoff spot, he traded away 27-year-old goalie Chris Osgood, the very goalie who had solved their goaltending issue just 2 years before. Believing Rick DiPietro was ready to be a full-time starter, Milbury sent Osgood to the St. Louis Blues for little return, a young forward, Justin Papino, and a draft pick. Osgood had won 49 games over 2 seasons and was popular with teammates, so moving him raised eyebrows. The pieces New York got back never panned out, and observers felt Milbury jumped the gun. A tandem of Osgood and DiPietro might have served better for the team, especially come playoff time. But Milbury's impatience showed again. At the 2003 draft, Milbury struck out again, taking Robert Nilsson, 15 overall, while future stars like Breeze went right after. Nilsson lasted just 53 games and 6 goals with the Owls before being dealt away, another missed chance that drained their pipeline. Though the Islanders reached the playoffs 3 straight years, they bowed out in the first round each time. By 2004, Yashin's play was slipping. Pekka clashed with him, and prospects like DiPietro weren't ready to lead, and it wasn't looking promising for the Islanders. By 2004, the NHL entered a lockout that would wipe out the entire 2004-2005 season, and the Islanders found themselves in an awkward position. They had some high-priced assets underperforming, very few top prospects in the pipeline, thanks to the years of trading away draft picks for young talent, and a fanbase still waiting for a single playoff series win. The brief success of the early 2000s started to fade. When play resumed in 2005-2006 after the lockout, the league had implemented a new salary cap system, forcing teams to be more careful with big contracts. The Islanders now looked positioned. They had a massive contract on the books for Yashin and expectations that Rick DiPietro would become an elite goalie to justify Milbury's gamble. However, in the 2005-2006 season, they struggled on the ice and missed the playoffs, prompting owner Charles Wang to finally make sweeping changes. In January 2006, Mike Milbury stepped down as GM, ending his decade-long grip on the team. Officially, he took a vague senior VP role in Wang's sports holdings, but effectively was out of the decision-making seat. It was widely believed Wang pushed Milbury out after his years of underachievement. Milbury's last season as GM was marked by more questionable choices. For instance, in August 2005, he traded team captain Michael Pekka to Edmonton for Mike York. Peck was coming off a dominant year and a lockout, but he went on to help the Oilers reach the Stanley Cup final in 2006, while York was a marginal contributor in New York. Moves like that amplified how, at the end, Milbury failed to get value for assets. By the time of his resignation, the Islanders had become a revolving door of coaches, players, and the laughingstock of the NHL. The true cost of Milbury's reign was felt long after he left. By the late 2000s, the Islanders were rebuilding again, but without the assets they should have had. Milbury had traded away a staggering list of future stars: Chara, Luongo, Bertuzzi, Jokinen. You get where I'm going. In return, the Owls got basically nothing. The few wins here and there, like Kenny Johnson or Roman Harmlik, were buried under the weight of failures. The most painful losses were Chara and Luongo, both whom became franchise cornerstones and captains elsewhere. And the Isles had none of that star power, because their best draft picks and prospects were other jerseys. Draft misfires only deepened the hole, picking Rick DiPietro, #1 overall in 2000, and selecting Robert Nilsson in 2003, while future stars were still on the table. After Milbury's exit in 2006, GM Garth Snow began cleaning up the house. However, this was no easy task. He bought out Yashin in 2007, leaving the team paying him until 2015. With no young core in place, the Owls struggled at the bottom until drafting John Tavares in 2009, finally the ending Milbury era drought of homegrown stars. It took until 2016 for the Owls to win the first playoff series in 23 years, a reminder of how long it took to escape Milbury's shadow. And today, Milbury is remembered as one of the worst GMs in NHL history, a man whose constant tinkering left the dynasty turned dormant, with nothing to show but lost talent and wasted years. From bold trades, quick fixes, and impatience that gutted the franchise and made the Islanders a laughingstock of the NHL. The Islanders eventually recovered, but fans still grimly recall what they survived during the Milbury years, a decade defined by squandered stars and what-ifs.